Part 6 of the County Regiment. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Epistomelus. The County Regiment, by Dudley L. Vaill. Part 6. The brilliant victories in which the Second Artillery had borne so worthy a part, and the re-election of President Lincoln in November 1864, put an end to all anxieties as to danger in the quarter of the Shenandoah, which before Sheridan's campaign had been a region of fatal mischance to the national cause from the beginning of the war. As a consequence, the Sixth Corps was once more ordered to rejoin Grant's army, and the regiment left the historic valley on December 1st, arriving on the 5th before Petersburg, where it was assigned a position near the place of its skirmish on June 22nd. Then it was unbroken forest, says its history. Now hundreds of acres were cleared and dotted with camps. A corduroy road ran by, and a telegraph, and Grant's railroad. No other such railroad was ever seen before, or ever will be again. It was laid right on top of the ground, without any attempt at grading, and you might see the engine and rear car of a long train, while the middle of the train would be in a valley, completely out of sight. Having reached Park Station, we moved to a camp near Battery No. 27, and went into the snug and elegant little log houses just vacated by the 94th New York. This was a new kind of situation for the Second Heavies. The idea of being behind permanent and powerful breastworks, defended by abatis, ditches, and what not, with approaches so difficult that 10 men could hold 500 at bay, was so novel that the men actually felt as if there must be some mistake, and that they had got into the wrong place. For 2 months no fighting fell to the regiment's lot, for though the Union commanders and armies were ready and eager to make an end of the war as soon as possible, little could be done during the winter. Though this inactivity brought perhaps some relief from the rigors of army life, the men had numerous reminders that they were still in active service. One of the chief events of this season the history of the regiment describes as follows. On the afternoon of the 9th December, 1864, the 1st and 3rd Divisions of the 6th Corps were marched to the left, beyond the permanent lines, and off in the direction of the Weldon Railroad, to prevent any attack on the 5th and 2nd Corps now returning from their expedition. After going for about 6 miles, we halted for the night in a piece of woods. It was bitter cold when we left camp, but soon began to moderate, then to rain, then to sleet, so that by the time we halted everything was covered with ice, with snow 2 inches deep on the ground and still sifting down through the pines. It was the work of an hour to get fires going, but at last they began to take hold, and fuel was piled on as though it did not cost anything. Clouds of steam rolled out of the soaked garments of the men as they stood huddled around the roaring, cracking piles, and the black night and ghostly woods were lighted up in a style most wonderful. The storm continued all night, and many a man waked up next morning to find his legs firmly packed in new fallen snow. At daylight orders came to pack up and be ready to move at once, which was now a difficult order to execute on account of many things, especially the shelter tents, for they were as rigid as sheet iron, and yet had to be rolled up and strapped on the knapsacks. Nevertheless, it was not long before the regiment was in motion, and after plodding off for a mile to the left, a line of battle was formed, vedettes sent out, trees felled and breastworks built, and at dinner time the men were allowed to build fires and cook breakfast. Then, after standing until almost night in the snow, which had now turned to sleet, the column was headed homeward. Upon arriving, it was discovered that some of the Jersey Brigade had taken possession of our log snuggeries, and that their officers had established their heels upon the mantels in our officers' quarters, and were smoking the pipes of comfort and complacency as though they had not a trouble in the world and never expected to have. But they soon found that possession is not 9 points of military law by any means. An order from division headquarters soon sent them profanely packing, and the Second Heavies occupied. Though weeks were spent in such comparative comfort and immunity as the present situation afforded, the men felt as if they were resting over a volcano which might break into fierce activity at any moment. And as the winter passed, signs of the renewal of the struggle multiplied on all sides. On February 5, 1865, Part of the 2nd Connecticut was ordered to move out to support and protect the flank of the 5th Corps, which was engaged near Hatcher's Run, and accordingly left the comforts of the camp and bivouacked for the night a few miles away. The history of the regiment says, "It was bitter cold sleeping that night, so cold that half the men stood or sat around fires all night. In the morning the movement was continued. A little before sundown we crossed Hatcher's Run and moved by the flank directly into a piece of woods, the 2nd Brigade under Hubbard leading the division and the 2nd Connecticut under Skinner leading the brigade. Wounded men were being brought to the rear, and the noise just ahead told of mischief there. Colonel Hubbard filed to the left at the head of the column, along a slight ridge, and about half the regiment had filed when troops of the 5th Corps came running through to the rear, and at the same moment General Wheaton rode up with "Oblique to the left! Oblique to the left!" and making energetic gestures toward the rise of ground. The ridge was quickly gained, and fire opened just in time to head off a counter-fire and charge that was already in progress, but between the file left and the left oblique, and the breaking of our ranks by troops retreating from in front, and the vines and underbrush, which were so thick that they unhorsed some of the staff officers, there was a good deal of confusion, and the line soon fell back about 10 rods, where it was reformed and a vigorous fire poured, somewhat at random, a little to the left of our first position. The attempt of the enemy to get in on the left of the 5th Corps was frustrated. Our casualties were 6 wounded, some of them probably by our own men, and 1 missing. The position was occupied that night, and the next day until about sundown, when the brigade shifted some distance to the right and again advanced under an artillery fire to within a short distance of the rebel batteries and built breastworks. The rebel picket shots whistled overhead all the time the breastworks were building, but mostly too high to hurt anything but the trees. At midnight the division moved back to quarters, arriving at sunrise. Having taken a ration of whiskey which was ordered by Grant or somebody else in consideration of 3 nights and 2 days on the bare ground in February, together with some fighting and a good deal of hard marching and hard work, the men lay down to sleep as the sun rose up and did not rise up until the sun went down. The routine of picket duty, inspection, alarms, and orders to be in readiness, which came not infrequently, continued for another succession of weeks, varied now by the constant arrival of deserters from the enemy, who were coming into the Union lines singly and in large parties almost daily, and revealing the desperate condition on the other side. Preparations went on for what all felt was to be the final campaign, and this opened for the 2nd Connecticut on March 25th, when the famous assault on Fort Stedman was made by the enemy, Lee's last attempt at offensive operations. This position, which was on the eastern side of the city of Petersburg, was gallantly attacked and captured in the early morning. Troops were at once called from all parts of the Union line and hurried to the point of action, but the fort was retaken before the 2nd Connecticut reached the scene, and the regiment was then moved to the southwest of the city before Fort Fisher, a general assault of the whole extensive line having been ordered by Grant to develop the weakness that Lee must have been obliged to make somewhere to carry out his plan against Fort Stedman. The attack succeeded in gaining and holding a large share of the Confederate picket line, a matter of great importance. The 2nd Connecticut advanced to the charge late in the afternoon, as steadily as though on a battalion drill, the regimental history relates. It captured a line of rifle pits and kept on under a combined artillery and musket fire. The air was blue with the little cast-iron balls from spherical case shot which shaved the ground and exploded among the stumps just in rear of the line at intervals of only a few seconds. 20 of the 2nd Connecticut were wounded, 7 of them mortally, in reaching, occupying, and abandoning this position, which, proving entirely untenable, was held only a few minutes. The line faced about and moved back under the same mixed fire of solid shot, spherical case, and musketry, and halted not far in front of the spot whence it had first moved forward. Other troops on the right now engaged the battery and captured the rest of the picket line, and after half an hour the brigade again moved forward to a position still further advanced than the previous one, where a permanent picket line was established. The week following this eventful day, which began with the capture of one of the Union works and ended with substantial gains along their front, saw intense activity on all sides. The abandonment of Petersburg by Lee was now plainly imminent, and the preventing of his army's escape was the paramount object. The whole vast field of operation about the besieged city became a seething theater of complicated movement, and the Second Connecticut, under frequent orders for immediate advance, was formed in line at all hours of the day or night, and excited by 1,000 rumors and orders given and revoked, but it did not finally leave its quarters during this time. On April 1st, Sheridan won his notable victory at Five Forks, and at midnight the regiment was ordered out for a final charge on the defenses so long held against them, which was to be made early on the 2nd. All was made ready, the lines formed, and at daylight the signal gun set the army in motion. The advance was over precisely the same ground as on the 25th of March, and the firing came from the same battery and breastworks, although not quite so severe. Lieutenant Colonel Skinner and 7 enlisted men were wounded, none of them fatally. There was but little firing on our side, but with bayonets fixed the boys went in, not in a very mathematical right line, but strongly and surely, on until the first line was carried. Then, invigorated and greatly encouraged by success, they pressed on, the opposing fire slackening every minute, on through the abatis and ditch, up the steep bank, over the parapet into the rebel camp that had but just been deserted. Then and there the long-tried and ever-faithful soldiers of the Republic saw daylight, and such a shout as tore the concave of the morning sky it were worth dying to hear. The same jubilant success was attending the whole army, though not without sharp resistance on the part of the enemy in places. Throughout the day advances were made, and the works so long besieged were occupied all over the vast field, and at night the men lay down in muddy trenches, among the dying and the dead, under a most murderous fire of sharpshooters. There had been charges and countercharges, but our troops held all they had gained. At length the hot day gave place to chilly night, and the extreme change brought much suffering. The men had flung away whatever was fling-awayable during the charge of the morning and the subsequent hot march, as men always will under like circumstances, and now they found themselves blanketless, stockingless, overcoatless, in cold and damp trenches, and compelled by the steady firing to lie still or adopt a horizontal crawling mode of locomotion, which did not admit of speed enough to quicken the circulation of the blood. Some took clothing from the dead and wrapped themselves in it. Others, who were fortunate enough to procure spades, dug gopher holes and burrowed. At daylight the 65th New York clambered over the huge earthwork, took possession of Fort Hell, opened a picket fire and fired one of the guns in the fort, eliciting no reply. Just then a huge fire in the direction of the city, followed by several explosions, convinced our side that Lee's army had indeed left. The regiment was hastily got together, 90 muskets being all that could be produced, and sent out on picket. The picket line advanced, and meeting with no resistance, pushed on into the city. What regiment was first to enter the city is, and probably ever will be, a disputed question. The Second Connecticut claims to have been in first, but Colonel Hubbard had ordered the colors to remain behind when the regiment went out on the skirmish line. Consequently, the Stars and Stripes that first floated over captured Petersburg belonged to some other regiment. Colonel Hubbard was, however, made provost marshal of the city, and for a brief while dispensed government and law in that capacity. Petersburg, however, now that it was abandoned by the enemy, had lost the importance it had so long possessed, and all energies were given to preventing the escape of its late defenders. Before the end of the day, April 3rd, the regiment, with the rest of the Sixth Corps, had turned westward and joined the pursuit. The chase was stern and the marches rapid, but far less wearing to these victorious veterans, filled with the consciousness of success, than those that had initiated their campaigning less than a year before. On April 6th the regiment, after an all-day march, came up with the enemy in position at Sailor's Creek and went into the last engagement of its career. It was a charge under a hot fire, sharp and decisive, which quickly changed to a pursuit of the fleeing enemy, kept up until the bivouac at 10 o'clock. The 2nd Connecticut captured the headquarters train of General Mahone, a battle flag, and many prisoners, and ended the tale of its losses with 3 men killed and 6 wounded. The chase was taken up next morning, April 7th, and the regiment had reached a point close to Appomattox Courthouse, when on April 9th Lee met Grant, and surrendered what remained of his army at that historic place. To imagine all that this meant to the men in arms is far easier than to attempt its description. They saw at last the end arriving of all the privation and suffering they had volunteered to undergo. They saw the triumph of the Union they had risen to defend to the uttermost extremity a proven fact. The whole continent vibrated with the deepest feeling at the news of it, but they, better than any others, knew in the fullest degree its immense significance. Immediately after the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Sixth Corps was moved to Burkesville, some distance from Appomattox in the direction of Richmond, and there it remained for about 10 days, awaiting events. On April 22nd it was ordered southward to Danville, with a view to joining Sherman's army then confronting Johnston in North Carolina, a movement which again necessitated some fatiguing marches, the 105 miles being covered in less than 5 days. News was received, however, that Johnston had followed the example of Lee and surrendered, and the corps thereupon faced about once more. On its leisurely progress to the north it was joined by crowds of the newly freed negroes, who attached themselves to every regiment in droves, and the lately hostile inhabitants came also at every stopping place, with baskets and 2-wheeled carts, for supplies to relieve their dire necessities. Near Richmond the regiment remained several days, and the men were allowed passes to visit the late Confederate capital, so long the goal of their strenuous efforts. The burnt district was still smoking with the remains of the great fire of April 2nd, and the city was full of officers and soldiers of the ex-Confederate army. The blue and the gray mingled on the streets and public squares, and were seen side by side in the Sabbath congregations. The war was over. The consciousness of this last great fact was now becoming insistent in the minds of these citizen soldiers. The great purpose for which they had offered themselves was carried out, and their eagerness to have done with all the circumstances of military life was increasingly strong, and grew so intense as to render the final weeks of their term of service extremely trying. The tremendous task of disbanding the armies of the Union was occupying the entire energies of the War Department, but to the men it seemed as if their longed-for turn would never come. Back in the well-known fortifications around Washington they waited, taking part in the grand review on June 8th in all the misery of full dress, and in a temper that would have carried them against the thousands of acclaiming spectators with savage joy had it been a host of enemies in arms. But their turn came at last, and on July 7th 183 men, all that were left of the original enlisted men of the old 19th, were mustered out. 2 days later they departed for New Haven, and were welcomed there, like all the returning troops, with patriotic rejoicing. The remainder of the regiment, some 400 in number, was mustered out in its turn on August 18th, reached New Haven on the 20th, and passed up Chapel Street amid welcoming crowds of people, the clangor of bells, and a shower of rockets and red lights that made the field and staff horses prance with the belief that battle had come again. After partaking of a bounteous entertainment prepared in the basement of the State House, the regiment proceeded to Grapevine Point, where, on the 5th of September, they received their pay and discharge, and the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery vanished from sight and passed into history. In Litchfield County the return of the various contingents to their homes was made the occasion of great rejoicing. Chief among these celebrations was a grand reception at the county seat on August 1st, when the first detachment to be discharged had arrived. They were feted with dinner and speeches, illuminations, and a triumphal arch. There were also other organized demonstrations in other towns, and everywhere the strongest manifestations of pride in these warrior sons of the county, and joy at their return. But all who went had not returned. The terrible significance of the cold and formal columns and tables of the regiment's casualties was felt in every town. and to their tale was added in succeeding years a long list of the many who had indeed come back, but broken with wounds and disease, and just as truly devoted to death through their service as those who fell upon the field of battle. What the Second Connecticut suffered is shown, so far as official statistics go, in the tables published by the Adjutant General of the state, as follows: killed, 147; missing in action, probably killed, 11; fatally wounded, 95; wounded, 427; captured, 72; died in prison, 21; died of disease or accident, 154; discharged for disability, 285; unaccounted for at muster out, 35. The officers of the regiment as mustered out were: Colonel James Hubbard, Salisbury; Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Skinner, Winchester; Majors Edward W. Jones, New Hartford; Augustus H. Fenn, Plymouth; Chester D. Cleveland, Barkhamsted; Adjutant Theodore F. Vaill, Litchfield; Quartermaster Edward C. Huxley, Goshen; Surgeon Henry Plum, New Milford; Assistant Surgeons Robert G. Hazard, New Haven; Judson B. Andrews, New Haven; Chaplain Winthrop H. Phelps, Barkhamsted. End of Part 6. Recording by Epistomelus, Cupertino, California, epcomm.com/school.